Hello and welcome to Connect. I'm your host, Randy Shabilo. On today's show, we'll have Jeff O'Brien talking about the 100th anniversary of Memorial Avenue, as well as Kim Alley and Doors Open Saskatoon. As always, we'd like to connect with you. Follow us on Facebook at ConnectYXE, catch past interviews on YouTube, email us at connectyxe@gmail.com, or leave a message at 306-665-3796. Saskatoon has a special event coming up in June. We have City Archivist Jeff O'Brien with us today to talk a little bit about that. Jeff, thanks for coming down.
Randy, thank you for having me.
I want to ask you, first of all, the City Archivist and your role. The number of times that we've interacted, it's always engaging to hear there's more than just an object or a building or a street. There's always the stories, and you're brilliant at it. Tell us what's happening with the Memorial Avenue and the Decoration Day coming up in June.
Okay, on June 18th, on the Sunday, we're having an event at Woodlawn Cemetery. Sort of two things happening at the same time. First of all, we're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Memorial Avenue of Trees in Woodlawn Cemetery, which is the First World War memorial, which was planted in 1923. And the second thing is it's Decoration Day, right? Decoration Day is an annual observance commemorating Canada's fallen soldiers, and usually happens in August. But this year we're going to have it in June, so we can put the two events together. And it's also a fairly significant year. I mean, I don't know about significant, but the first Decoration Day was 1916. So they've been doing this every year for 106 years. So that's kind of special. So what's happening is we're going to start with, it all happens at 1 o'clock in Woodlawn Cemetery on June 18th. So we're going to start with the Memorial Avenue of Trees ceremony, and that's basically to commemorate the founding of Memorial Avenue of Trees. And then they'll segue into Decoration Day. And so the Lieutenant Governor is going to be there, and he'll speak, and Mayor Charlie Clark is going to be there, and they'll be unveiling 3 new pedestals on the Soldiers' Cairn to acknowledge Canadian soldiers' involvement in United Nations operations and NATO operations and Afghanistan.
When we have all of these trees that were planted, were they dedicated, or how many were there, and what was the general idea at the time when they were planted?
Okay, well, we'll have to go back to 1922. And actually it all starts with these two women, two Saskatoon women, Margaret Hanson and Jean Jarvis. And they were members of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire, which was a very influential women's group for many, many years in Canada. And they had the idea that we should plant some trees in Woodlawn Cemetery as a war memorial to the men who had fallen during the First World War. So you have to understand about the 1920s, right? In the 1920s, there were war memorials were put up in cities and towns all across the country. There were thousands of them. And usually war memorials are really similar, right? They're marble and they're granite and they're a statue or a cenotaph or a cairn or something like that. But there's a school of thought that says a better way to do a war memorial is a practical war memorial, like a school or a hospital or a library, right? Something that actually serves the country and serves the community, because soldiers serve the country and serve the community, so there's a connection. So the idea of planting an arboreal memorial, a row of trees, or 2 rows of trees in this case, has the same kind of idea, because trees also serve. Here, I'll read you something. There's a letter that the IODE, so okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In an interview in 1951, what they said was that originally the idea was just to get the city to plant a few trees, right, to pretty up the cemetery. And then when they got talking with the IODE about it, it morphed into this idea of a war memorial. And so the IODE sends out a letter, right? Okay, so here's the plan. We're gonna plant. People will pay money, not very much, $7. For their $7, they get a tree planted and then a plaque affixed to the tree with the name and the details of a particular loved one, right? So the idea is that individuals will dedicate individual trees to individual people. Most war memorials are sort of collective things. These were to be very personal things, right? Where we're dedicating them to somebody that we care about, a father or a son or a husband or a brother or whatever it is, right? So this is what they're going to do. And so the IODE sends out this letter, 1,500 copies of a circular letter that they talk about it in the churches, the city's pushing, everybody's pushing this whole, and the whole idea is one of the tree is a symbol of service. This is from the letter the IODE wrote. He said, "A tree is a thing of beauty and an inspiration and a symbol of service. For the life of a tree is a life of service. And even the end of a tree's life isn't the end of a tree's service. Therefore, is not a tree a fitting symbol for those who gave their lives for the service of their country?" So it totally works, right? So anyway, they set the date for June of 1923. They had this big event. 8,000 people came out to see the dedication of Memorial Avenue of trees. So the original plan with the avenue, or as they discuss it, as it evolved over time, but at first they're talking about, nowadays, and so if you, just in case anybody who doesn't know, this is the road, when you come into Woodlawn Cemetery from 33rd Street, this is the road you drive in on, right? And it's got these 2 rows of American elms on each side, right? That's the original stretch of the Memorial Avenue, from the 33rd Street gates to the interior gates, which would be about at 36th Street. But when they first talked about it, they talked about running the trees all the way down 3rd Avenue, down to Queen Street, and actually something I read suggested that they would run them all the way down to downtown. So at 3rd Avenue, all the way down into downtown, would have these rows of trees. In the end, they didn't do that, so that the Memorial Avenue of trees just ends at the gates at 33rd Street. And then over time, it spread out, right? So that first year, 1923, there were 266 trees dedicated. Nowadays, there's a little over 1,200 trees dedicated to soldiers, fallen soldiers, and they're spread out all through the cemetery. So they all together constitute the Memorial Avenue of trees.
That's a lot, and if you say there were so many of these memorials of different kinds across Canada, how many are left today?
Well, that's the thing. One. Okay, so in the 1920s, the First World War had a huge impact on Canada. We were a very young nation. In a country of 6 million people, 600,000 people wore a uniform during the First World War. That was 1 in 10. More than 66,000 of them died. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Some people lived with the effects of the war for the rest of their lives. And so the legacy of the First World War in the 1920s was everywhere you looked. Every street corner, every barber shop, every home lived with the memory of the war. And so there's all this going on during the 1920s of commemoration of the war. One of the things they did in a few places, not just Saskatoon, was plant trees. So Victoria had a Memorial Avenue of trees, Calgary, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, North Bay, and what later became Thunder Bay, and maybe a couple others. And so not all of these had individual plaques, right? Dedicated individual trees dedicated to individual soldiers, but there were a few like that, and a few were just places where they planted trees and called it, Road of Remembrance. But what happens is, over the years, they all go away, right? If you build your trees on either side of a quiet road, and then that becomes a busy road, well, what's the first thing that happens when a road becomes busy? Well, exactly. And so the trees have to go. And that happened. And there was a forgetting, right? There was a neglect on the part of some jurisdictions where they just simply, let them go. Mm-hmm. I read about in North Bay, kids vandalizing the North Bay Road. They would make a game of riding by on their bikes and trying to strip off the plaques as they went. And eventually North Bay took all the plaques off and they put them on a wall somewhere, took all the trees down. So over the years, all of these, and Dutch elm disease played havoc with some of the trees, right, in some places. So over the years, all of those other Memorial Avenues have gone away. And so what ends up happening is, so in 1992, Heritage Canada declared our next of kin Memorial Avenue of trees to be a National Historic Monument because it is still what it was when it was first dedicated 100 years ago. And it's a living monument because they add new dedications every year. And because we built ours in a cemetery, it has remained.
You mentioned a couple of names earlier about what happened to their sons, some notable Saskatoonians.
Right. Okay. So that first, the first 266 trees that were dedicated, most of them were to individual soldiers. And most of them were Saskatoon or Saskatoonan area, although not all of them, but nearly all of them. And so a couple that, all sorts of names, right? But a couple that stand out as being sort of historically memorable, there was Tom Klinkskill, and he was the only son of Saskatoon's first mayor, James Klinkskill. Mrs. Klinkskill had a whole pack of daughters, like 7 or 8 daughters, but she had one son, and him she gave to the Empire. So he died at the Somme in 1916. And there was another fellow, Grenville Hopkins. His father was also a mayor of Saskatoon, William Hopkins, a well-known local businessman, and he died during his first night in the trenches. And so the thing to remember about one of the things that makes the Memorial Avenue such a powerful monument is none of these guys was repatriated. In the First World War, they buried them very close to where they fell, and they never came home again. And so it's not like I'm going to go to the cemetery on Sunday and stop by, my son's grave and put some flowers on. That's not happening ever. And so, in fact, it wasn't allowed to happen. Even if you wanted to repatriate your loved one's remains, they didn't allow it to happen. William Hopkins moved heaven and earth to try to get his son's remains home. The story ends with his agent having actually unofficially disinterred Grenville Hopkins' bones and have him stopped with his foot on the gangplank to the ship to take him home with a suitcase with the remains in the suitcase. Wow. So he hired a guy to go dig up his son to bring the remains home, and they wouldn't let him. And so the fact that we have this monument where the people whose loved ones these were could go and have a place they could touch that was dedicated specifically to their person made it hugely intimate, right? Made it very important, and so it's a powerful monument to a terrible time.
I appreciate all of the work that has gone into this and the background that you bring in particular to that. So we'll have this event June 18th, 1 o'clock,
right,
at the Woodlawn Cemetery entrance.
Right, and we're expecting a good turnout, so we're suggesting that people arrive between 12 and 12:30. Parking is, there'll be parking people on site to guide you to where you're going to park and to help you get out again, and it should be a wonderful show.
I hope we have 8,000 people there. Thanks so much for coming by.
Well, thank you for having me.
Stay with us, we'll be right back.